I have my daughter's like Rose the Riveter socks on this morning because I didn't have clean socks.
love it.
And I'm super conscious of it.
No, I love it.
Okay.
Ready? Okay. So thank you for doing this.
Of course.
I am super excited to talk about this because this book validated me in a way that was very unexpected. I like took the marriage plot out of my life story, and I was like, how would my life be, you know, if I don't get married or whatever? And it was really just this different experience. What inspired the moment that you started research for all the single ladies?
Well, as a journalist who writes about women in politics and in society and about the feminist movement and just about the world through a feminist lens, I had been, as a reporter, I'd known for years that the number of single women was rising really rapidly and that the marriage age was changing. And I knew just as a reporter that there was this shift in marriage patterns happening in the United States, and I kind of knew that it was happening around the world just because I'd had to do, I'd written about stories about there are now more single women in New York than married women, things like that. I knew that this was a thing that was mathematically true. And then personally, I was unmarried through my 20s into my 30s, and actually had thought a lot about my own life as a single person because, unlike many of my friends who are also unmarried during those years, I really wasn't in any kind of romantic or committed sexual relationship. I wasn't really even in uncommitted sexual relationships. I was single. I was like non-single through my 20s. And, I had all kinds of different experiences of that singlehood, but it was so stark that I had thought a lot about it. I really considered myself a romantically alone person, in good and bad ways. And then I fell in love in my early 30s, and I was getting married in my mid 30s, and which I was very thrilled about. It was a wonderful experience falling in love, and I didn't much care about the fact that we were getting married, but there were other reasons why we were doing it. But the way that people started to treat me, wanting me to register for dishes and stuff and like have bachelorette parties where like I got underwear or whatever. And I was like, this is so anachronistic. This doesn't make sense in my life. I'm 35 years old. My husband is 45. Like, we have more dishes than we can eat, than we can stand. We need to get rid of dishes. We're combining 2 adult lives worth of dishes. And it really struck me how the rituals around marriage, and in fact, more broadly, how we still think of marriage. I was also really struck by how happy people were that I was getting married. Now, I personally was really happy. I was really happy, to have met somebody who I enjoyed spending my time with so much. But the way that other people were congratulating me as if this were the most important achievement of my life really made me uncomfortable. And it was... I just was... And it was also a shift for me as somebody who had truly been independent from marriage and from any kind of committed romance, from the adulthood during which I'd really become like a full person. I developed my career, I'd made my home, I built friendships, I grew into a mature relationship with my family. I was an adult, a whole person. And it was lovely that I had fallen in love and that I was getting married. But I was really struck by the way that this lingering, and my friends were whole people without being married. Sure. And I knew that from my reporting that the country was filled with women like me who are whole people in many different ways. Yeah. And yet, the fact that I was getting married still provoked this lingering sense that this made me a valid adult. Yeah. And so that prompted me to do an exploration of, I thought I was going to do a book of contemporary journalism and interview women around the country, which I did. I did wind up doing this, about their experiences of singlehood. Sure. But then the thing that I discovered as I started to write that book of contemporary journalism is that there was this rich history of single women in the United States and the ways that single life for women, life independent of marriage, and in earlier eras often from motherhood, when marriage and motherhood were so intimately linked. Sure. That women living independent from marriage had played crucial roles in the abolition and suffrage movements, the labor movements, the settlement house movements. I began to look at the history of the United States through the lens of how women were behaving around marriage patterns, around marriage and singlehood, and discovered there was a tremendous story to be told. So it became a book that had both history and contemporary reporting in it.
I'm so fascinated by that because I feel like in the 90s I was so amazed by like the women in my life and the women that were were raising me, and I was always seeing these women. I grew up in the era of like Living Single and Sex and the City, and so on TV I saw, you know, this sort of womanhood that I was after, and I think that there's a bit of a difference that happened, or something changed, that there's now this authentic storytelling that's happening around a woman's experience. What do you think has changed? And before you wrote Big Girls Don't Cry, like what was happening before this like authentic rush of us being unapologetically represented?
There were very few popular models for singlehood. I mean, if you look in terms of literature, you go way back and you have, for example, The Scarlet Letter. I mean, there couldn't, you know. In fact, some of the books that I grew up, The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, which is about Lily Bart, this character who was in search of a husband. You had to be, in earlier eras when women were economically dependent on men in different ways and sexually dependent on men, when before a sexual revolution, before a feminist movement, before the legalization of both birth control and abortion, before women had reproductive control, there was a sense in which marriage had to be a central goal for so many women if they wanted to be economically stable, because there weren't other ways outside of inheritance for women to
make a name for themselves,
or even to just have economic stability, to be able to pay the rent, to be able to feed themselves. You sort of had to be attached to somebody who could make the money, and that kind of person in the United States for a very long time was a man. You couldn't have a socially sanctioned sex life outside of marriage. You couldn't have a family outside of marriage. All these things that now are possible. Up until very recently, in terms of the historic record, they were not possible for women. And so you have all these stories of women, the women who lived outside, either rebelliously or by accident, and often they end up very tragically. That's true in, that's true in The House of Mirth. That's true in, certainly in The Scarlet Letter. In Sula. I mean, this is, there are all of these narratives of what happens to women who don't attach themselves to men. And that was, and in part, because in life, there were fewer of them in these various eras. Their experience was reflected in the literature.
And was there a bit of irony, though? Because let's go look at Jane Eyre, for example, and how Bronte was this independent woman, and it was marriage that... why would her story, why was it? Well,
that's the story of Austen, too. So Jane Austen actually died single. She never married. And her books are all about, a critical look at the imperatives of the marriage plot. And her heroines, as she gets older, grow increasingly anxious about their fate. Are we going to be able to have a house? Are we going to be able, you see in Sense and Sensibility, by the time she gets to Persuasion, it's a really dark book. It's very sad, for all that Austen is credited as being a comedian and a, sort of taking note of the social absurdities of this marriage market. She's also painting a really stark picture of the fact that there were no other options, and she was a sort of a living embodiment of it. She was dependent on her male relatives. Charlotte Bronte is an example. Yes, the stories of love. I always thought Jane Eyre was kind of a pretty dark story about love. I don't think Mr. Rochester was like the catch of the century.
I never understood that. I was just like, do you see this man, Jane? Get it together, girl.
Yeah, he kept his first wife in the attic.
I was like, I wish you would have had this book, because she would raise the bar on the kind of man that you would fall in love with.
Right, but she couldn't. And one of the things about Charlotte that's so fascinating is she winds up marrying this curate who takes care of her father. And she does it so that she and her father will be economically stable into their own age.
Yeah. And then when he tried to censor her letters to her friend.
Yes. he tries, the husband is so distressed by the frankness of her letters between Charlotte and her friends that he asks her not to send them or to read all of them and monitor them. And it's this really tragic correspondence where she says, I can't write freely to you anymore. He says he's going to look at all the letters. And then, of course, she's an example. She gets pregnant and she dies as a pregnant woman, which was not uncommon.
Tragic enough,
So, and she says it's a very, she says that the lesson of having married this guy who she didn't have any love for, she didn't really,
she felt obligated to do it.
Yeah, and she says, I now know from experience what I would have said before, which is wait weight. And she says, sometimes she writes very powerfully about the loss of freedom. She says, sometimes I would have just liked to have taken a walk, and taken a walk. And the Charlotte Bronte's letters about marriage are incredibly sad, and her marriage was very brief, and it was pretty bleak. Yeah. So, but there wasn't, you can't raise the bar if you're not, that's one of the things that the era of independent womanhood can't exist without social policies, and in fact, we still lack many of them. Yeah. So, and in a Trump administration, they're going to be more imperiled than they have been for decades, certainly, since I think that one of the aims is to roll back the kinds of progress that have enabled women to live independently from marriage. Mm-hmm. So when you see an attack on health care, when you see an attack on reproductive rights, what you're doing is seeing
a pushback to this institution.
A pushback and a systemic removal from women of the kind of rights that enable their independence. Yeah. And what we needed instead, it's not that we had these perfect circumstances for women to live independently of marriage should they wish or should circumstances dictate. We needed paid leave. Mandated paid leave. We needed higher minimum wages. 2/3 of workers are minimum wage workers are women. Tipped workers are women. We needed wage adjustments, wage hikes. We needed redistributive economic policies, subsidized daycare that enable women to be in the workforce.
And we need to understand that these aren't handouts, but these are the exact things that men have been afforded through the subjugation of women into marriage or into, dependent culture.
Right. The opponents from the right characterize this as, they actually say, these are Beyonce voters, meaning they talk about all the single ladies, independent women, but they actually want Uncle Sam to be their husbands, right?
Exactly.
This is the critique. But the irony is that white men in the United States have always had the support of Uncle Sam as their enfranchisement was guaranteed from the beginning and protected ever since, when in fact the enfranchisement of women and people of color was
it's been the greatest projection of like a welfare system.
Exactly. Yeah. Tax breaks, business loans, housing loans, entire communities that were developed in the middle of the 20th century to house families that were run by white men at the same time that there weren't the kinds of protections put in place to permit women and people of color to gain or expect fair pay and equal wages,
and then made it sound crazy for just asking for it. Exactly. It was almost like it felt like God created men and then the government created husbands. It was like,
that's right.
It just feels as if there's now this. It's almost like husband 2.0. Like the more that you say things that are logical, the government comes in and it's like, no, you don't actually need gun control. You just need women to get married, or you don't need this. You need it's just
that's something, by the way, that Mitt Romney actually said in a debate in 2012 in a debate against Barack Obama. The question was, what are you going to do about gun violence in America? And Mitt Romney's answer was, well, I think women should marry someone. This was the idea that and it's all a sort of a deeply racist set of argument that's been going, always.
This projection of it. So given like the political climate of everything right now too, you conclude the book talking about how we need to rebuild the world for the diverse women that live in it more freely. What do you think are the tools and the strategy that we need to be mindful of? Well, are you hopeful?
I think that they've changed a lot. One of the things is that I wrote this book. I did not think that Hillary Clinton was going to be elected president. I didn't necessarily think that.
You didn't?
Well, I was nervous about it. I wrote the book before she was even run. I should add that I finished writing this book before she'd even announced she was getting in the race. But my first book had been about her 2008 candidacy, and I strongly suspected, like everyone did, that she would run. Yeah. But I did think it was going to be very hard. I think in part because if you read about the history of the United States, what you see are these eras of progress and then really powerful backlash. Yeah. And after two administrations, two Barack Obama administrations, we like to pretend that we're better and cooler than we are. It was a very big deal for the United States to elect a black president. And after two administrations, you could tell that there was going to be tremendous backlash against that. And I thought that it was very perilous for Hillary Clinton, for a woman to be the candidate I was all for it, but at the same time, I understood that this was not something that the country was just going to warm to. Like, no, it's not just one exception to the white male presidential rule. This might be a new rule where white men don't just get to be the presidents. That's a massive shock to the system. But there were other things too. I mean, it's hard to win a third administration for one party. There are all kinds of reasons that I knew it was going to be difficult. However, what I did not anticipate was that the person who was going to be the president, if it weren't a Democrat, if it weren't Hillary Clinton, was going to be this kind of fever dream monster of everything regressive in terms of race and gender. I mean, Donald Trump really is a monster from America's past, sort of summoned as a response to the Obama-Clinton
It's much better because I've been calling him Puss.
Yeah. He looks like,
I'm like, he was just a pimple that was ready.
But I mean, it's been a build up, and the circumstances of his victory are so interesting because it was a minority. It's minority rule, which is the history of America. White male dominance over the whole rest of the country is, in fact, the history of the United States. And here we have a guy who's the president of the United States having won 3 million fewer votes than his opponent. And everybody in his, I mean, he has the whitest, malest cabinet, and the kind of stuff he's really going for. I mean, this is not just rolling back the Obama administration.
This is going back.
This is rolling back the major social advancements of the late 20th century. I mean, this is rolling back and the stuff that's going to happen around voting rights, the stuff that's going to happen around wages if this guy Puzder is confirmed. Somebody who doesn't. Is there going to be a minimum wage? Are there going to be any kind of job protections? Certainly the reproductive rights. Mike Pence, our vice president, is probably one of the foremost foes of reproductive rights and access in this country. So we really are, it's a totally different set of battles to some degree because you're doing defense instead of expansion. What would have needed to happen if we'd had Hillary Clinton as president is women would have needed to push her. And I think to some degree you'd seen she'd already been pushed to really focus on stuff like redistributive policies around paid leave, subsidized daycare. She was pushed to go further on minimum wage. And we would have had to push her as president to make some of that stuff happen. Also push what would have likely have been a Republican-dominated Congress. When it comes to Trump, we're not just in pushing mode, we're in defense mode. We're protecting what's already in place. But it is also crucial when we do that we don't readjust our bar. We still do need to go further. We need to go where we would have pushed Clinton to go. But at the same time, we have to protect what we're doing. So it's a much more complicated set of battles because we're doing defensive work.
Do you think we run the risk of stretching ourselves too thin?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the one thing I will say about this, in terms of there being a silver lining, is that there is, I mean, I think you see with the mobilization of really women-led resistance to Trump. I mean, this matters that it was a women's march that was the biggest protest in this country's history. I mean, that biggest one-day political demonstration in the history of the United States was women-led, women of color-led. You see a lot of the resistance within Congress even coming from people like Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Maxine Waters, Patty Murray. I mean, Barbara Lee, who has been pushing against the Hyde Amendment. And I watched Barbara Lee and Kirsten Gillibrand, two people who were pushing legislation that are crucial to exactly the ability of women to be independent. Sure. Barbara Lee pushing the Each Woman Act, which was opposition to the Hyde Amendment, which prevents federal insurance programs from being used to pay for abortion, which makes abortion, which is legal, inaccessible to poor women who rely on federal insurance programs. We need to abolish the Hyde Amendment. Barbara Lee's been pushing against that for 2 years and forced it into Hillary Clinton's platform, which was wonderful. She was the first president to run in part on abolishment of the Hyde Amendment. By the same token, Kirsten Gillibrand has been pushing the Family Act, which is a paid family leave act, which is really third rail politics 5 years ago, but which is crucial if you're going to have women in the workforce, that you're able to compensate them if they take time to have children, women and men, mothers and fathers, and people who need to take time to do elder care. That Kirsten Gillibrand had pushed as the Family Act, and that Clinton had adopted also into her platform. And in fact, she had an economic platform that was going to redefine infrastructure as being not just about bridges and tunnels, but about care industries, elder care and child care. This stuff was all revolutionary. And there's this one, on the one hand, there's the feeling that's like, oh, that stuff is all up in smoke. Now we're just we have to keep abortion legal, the very basics. Yeah. However, I'm really pleased to see both Barbara Lee and Kirsten Gillibrand continuing to push on those acts and say we still need to go in this direction, even if we're also sort of doing protective work on the almost looking backward. Yeah.
I'm reminded with this and like Bad Feminist and a lot of the literature that's been coming out, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's whole thing to push forward that women need to rise up and create the literature that will rouse the national conscience. What role do you think literature needs to play right now in the literary heroines that we need to see in keeping the mobilization and the momentum behind the mobilization? I
think it's always hard to tell. I mean, it's hard to tell what literature is going to hit and what's not going to hit. I was thinking about that Elizabeth Cady Stanton line, and I was thinking about
James Baldwin also has one too, where he says like literature is indispensable, and even though writers write to save the world, they know that it may not be enough, but still.
Right, and we have, this is the history in the United States. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was. The line about her was, I'd like to meet this little lady who started this big war. I think that, I know that as a child, the stuff that informed me about inequity in the world were the novels that I was reading. It was reading, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, or Annie John, or I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was a really important book for me when I was, I think, in middle school. That rather than simply being taught about race, I learned those from identifying with characters, from words on the page that I could find on my own, in my own private. I mean, that's one of the things about reading, right? That you're not doing it in a classroom, you're not doing it even in a movie theater. It's often a private experience where it's happening in your head.
And it's you and the author.
Yeah, it's you intimate. And the author. It's extremely intimate. I've been thinking about it recently because the other book that was really formative for me when I was a young person was The Handmaid's Tale. And at that point, The Handmaid's Tale, which was this dystopian look at a world in which, women had been stripped of their reproductive rights and were forced to be reproductive machines. I know that the filmed adaptation of The Handmaid's Tale is about to be released, and it seems very timely now. That's a book that's 30 years old. Yeah. So I think you never know. I mean, I think about Bad Feminist as a great example of that. Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which is obviously was a surprise bestseller. I mean, and that was at the top of the bestseller list for years and years. I mean, for months and months. Yeah. And sometimes books just hit at a particular moment. Between the World and Me came at a moment where we were talking about state violence against African Americans. And here was this, and Ta-Nehisi Coates is a beautiful writer, telling an intimate story about, his friend, his life, his loss, framed as a letter to his son. In terms of fiction, I'm trying to think about, I don't know yet what the fiction's going to be. I don't know yet what the contemporary fiction is going to be that sheds light on this period. I think this period is, we're still in shock. We were moving in this one direction, and then it came to this abrupt halt. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, that halt is producing an explosion of investment and activity, and I think it's just imagining one kind of future versus imagining an entirely different kind of future. And I don't know what the literature is going to be that comes out of it, but it is my hope that it will be powerful.
Cool. All right. I love Hermione Granger. She's like my literary heroine, and I would love to hear your thoughts on the role of Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings.
One of the interesting things that I've noticed in the resistance to Trump, right? And even in some of the ways that people talked during the election, was the use of literature that's not overtly about contemporary events, so that some of the stuff that I think of as the books that helped me understand gender, race, the kind of the Handmaid's Tale, or To Kill a Mockingbird, or Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, Alice Walker, The Color Purple, that stuff, it's obvious how that stuff ties into Native Son. That stuff is the stuff that helped me understand history, helped me understand race and gender. But then there's the category of books that are political, but that aren't really, that are fantasy books, but they become these useful touchstones in terms of how we understand characters, how we understand broader patterns throughout history. And so I've noticed, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I've been reading Harry Potter to her, and it's interesting because she got scared after the first book. She's 5, and you know,
I'm like,
I forget. You're like, wait, what part? It was actually it's a horrifying part. It's where Voldemort sucks the blood from the unicorn.
Okay.
Right. She was very scary to her. And then after the election, when I was feeling sort of traumatized, I asked her if we could start book 2. It was just helpful to me. And after that, she hasn't been scared. But it's interesting. I can see even in her 5-year-old brain thinking about good and bad supporters of some of the stuff that's in that book about mudbloods and the purity of blood and her early thoughts of an experience of a country that is in a discussion about race, that's in a discussion. I see her identifying with Hermione in certain ways. I see perhaps even more me again identifying with Hermione. I heard people talking throughout the election about, you know, Hillary Clinton as a Hermione figure, the sort of her besting Donald Trump in the debate. And, you know, to some extent you think, oh, these are just easy internet memes.
Sure.
But it helps people think, right, this is one of the things that literature is great for. And I just saw my father, who grew up reading Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, and of course those were books that were written, you know, in the mid 20th century, and they're political books too. Yeah. But my father, I noticed, posted yesterday on Facebook a passage from the first Lord of the Rings about, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was about the rise, you know, Sauron had died after The Hobbit, and he'd lost his bodily form, but then he rose again, and his power was rising again. And there are such profound echoes in terms of how the history of the country and good and evil around the world and hate and violence and periods of comparative peace, and then once again the rise of forces that would want to destroy that peace in one direction or another. And those fantasy books for children offer us ways to understand those incomprehensible forces in sort of more concrete and intimate ways. And I think they're very useful for understanding these too.
I'm having all of these like aha moments because specifically for Harry Potter, because that was what I grew up with, and understanding like looking at J.K. Rowling's the moment that she started writing it and having been on welfare and having gotten divorced, and this world that she crafted, even though she never in a million years imagined herself writing children's literature, and how much she prepared us, this generation that grew up underneath this like wizarding world, to know the truth and to have the courage of our convictions, because Harry or Hermione or Ron, you know, are our examples.
And Rowling, you're absolutely right. Rowling is a chief example of somebody who was living as a single woman, and who has been very vocal about the role that the welfare state played in enabling her work, her parenthood, her survival, that she benefited from the state in a way that enabled her to write these books, but also simply to take care of her child, to take care of herself. And she's been a really vocal proponent of exactly the ways that the world has to shift in order to accommodate these new ways that women are living in it. And she's an example of that as well. And you're right, that the work that she happened to be doing was work that sort of laid out a narrative template, I think based on older ones too, of forces of hate and autocracy and the fascist rise of an autocratic regime, and the forces who are arrayed against it.
Yeah, and she's just a badass on Twitter, like just...
She's just taking I know.
Right?
I know, yeah.
I like love it, and I just love how unapologetic she is, and I think that her life story just prepared her to prepare us, and it was just like the levels of it is really heartening. Yeah. So I'm gonna make her proud and keep wearing my Hermione stuff.
That's good. That's great.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and I'm glad that we could end it on a Harry Potter note.
Yeah, obviously, always.
This was so much fun. Yeah.
Thank you so much.